see you guys in the dark.
This specific time takes place between 2014 and 2015. So unfortunately, I was never really close to my grandfather at all. Mostly because when I was a baby, my parents emigrated to the UK, and since I was so young, I hadn't really ever spoken to him. We talk over the phone rarely, and when we did, it was always comforting to know that he was alive since he spent the last years of his life feeling poorly. I believe that he died in 2010 in April, exactly a month shy of his birthday. At this point, I was still living in the UK. My mom was on the phone with her brother that night, whom was present physically in the same room when my granddad passed back into our home country. It was quite sad, and I remember it like it was yesterday. My family, especially my mom, was very upset. She flew back to our home country for the funeral and stayed there for a few days. She stayed longer due to the eruption of a volcano in Iceland in the same year that stopped practically all air traffic. So fast forward to the summer of 2014. At this point, my family had already permanently moved back to our home country. My uncle, who was my mom's brother and grandfather's son, obviously, one day decided he wanted to put something on my granddad's grave. Something other than flowers, since they didn't last very long. He went out and bought this white angel and some paints for us to use. Since I'm quite artistic and into that sort of stuff, I agreed to help him. We spent at least 2 days on it, one to paint it, and the other to let it dry completely. Both of us tried really hard to make it look good, especially me, since I felt like that it would be a way to show that I respected him, despite our very non-acquainted relationship. Once we were satisfied with the results, we went back to the graveyard and placed the angel next to his tombstone. Since a bit of the lettering on the actual tombstone was fading, I had also brought along a black paint to fill the words in while we were there. About a week later, it's Sunday, and my uncle goes to church practically every week. That day after church had finished, he decided he wanted to visit the graveyard to check our angel. When he arrived, he found it was completely missing. He went around the small graveyard to see if somebody had possibly moved it, but it was nowhere to be seen. When my uncle informed me, I was super angry and sad about it. I couldn't understand how somebody could be so cruel, stealing something off someone else's grave. It was so disrespectful. I genuinely felt bummed that we'd put in so much work and effort for somebody else to just grab it and go home. The following week, every time I would leave the house, I'd try and take a peek into other people's gardens to check if it was there. Failed. I never found it. We tried to look on the bright side, and we assumed that whoever stole it took it because it looked good, since many other graves also had little statues of angels and ornate candles. Unfortunately, stealing is still a problem in my rather quiet and small neighborhood to this day. Houses are still being robbed, and just last year, somebody had the cheek to steal a gold necklace that was around the neck of Mary Magdalene in our church. Anyways, after 2 weeks, we realized it was definitely not going to show up. I had my own suspicions. There was this old lady in my neighborhood, notorious for being quite the kleptomaniac, and I instantly thought of her. Obviously, I never proved it. Sometime in April of 2015, my family were at my grandma's house eating dinner when the doorbell rang. My uncle, as per usual, went to answer it and found that nobody was outside. He got a little angered, thinking that the kids next door were playing stupid pranks on us. The doorbell didn't ring again after. When I later left, it was just as I was exiting the house that I realized the angel was outside. It was a little hidden, just to the left of the door, so my uncle probably couldn't see it when he opened it. It was in the exact same condition that we left it in, meaning it was probably left indoors. We never found out who put it back, but what was creepy about the situation was that our angel was delivered to the exact date that my grandfather had died. We were all very shocked, since we believed somebody was playing a really mean trick on us. We didn't take the angel back to the graveyard, fearing that it would be nicked again. My uncle did tell our priest about it. The priest told my uncle that apparently they had found weird pouches filled with what seemed like herbs and incense scattered around the graveyard. I'd heard of a few rumors that there were old ladies participating in witchcraft in my town, but nobody knew who would be doing such a thing. Portuguese people are quite superstitious, may I mention. When the priest was informed that the angel that was once on my grandfather's grave was oddly returned on the anniversary of his death, we suggested not to keep it in sight, fearing that maybe those witches had something to do with its mysterious disappearance in the first place. My uncle agreed, better safe than sorry, and the angel is currently sitting in my grandma's shed, right in the back. It might seem a bit weird, but for some people, I always found graveyards intriguing. I hope that I don't sound horribly morbid. And when my family would go visit my grandfather, I'd wander off and see practically every tombstone in the place. And I really just read people's names and the dates that they died. I'd also visit my paternal grandparents' graves. One day in May of the same year when my mom, my dad, and I were at a cafe pretty close to the cemetery, a person they knew arrived, and they started chatting. I found myself pretty bored. My mom realized that it was about 5:10 p.m., so my mom instructed me to place the flowers she had bought on my grandfather's grave since she and my dad were talking to this dude. The graveyard opens every day at 8 a.m. and closes at 5:30, and it was literally 1 minute away from the cafe. So I crossed the road with the flowers in my hand when suddenly, at the entrance, I was able to see that somebody was hunched down close to my grandfather's grave. From far away I could tell that it was an old woman whom I did not recognize, and she seemed to be very enthralled by the sight. So much so, I noticed she grabbed one of the wax candles sitting nearby. She didn't notice me at first, since she was quite far away. But she soon spotted me, and by the look on her face, she was very frightened. She looked as if she recognized me, since I had no idea who she could be, and since I also felt a little unsettled by her presence, I ran back to the cafe and told my mom about the woman. At that moment, she was still busy chatting with that friend of hers, and so she did not go straight away. There were 5 minutes left before the cemetery closed when my mom finally decided to come with me to see this supposed unknown woman. Almost coincidentally, the lady was gone. We ventured to the grave and found that the candle I aforementioned was missing. Coincidence? After describing her to my mom, she was sure that she had never seen that woman before, and she was most likely to blame for the angel's disappearance too. To this day, we still have no idea who the woman is, but I've always thought of the possibility that maybe my grandfather had a lover, and since she felt upset or angered that he was married to my grandmother, stealing things off of his grave made her feel better, or allowed her to get her revenge. I don't really know, but the look on her face still creeps me out. I'm certain that she knew who I was. A few years ago, I don't remember how many now, let's say I was in my early 20s, so that would put this story between 2008 and 2010. I was out camping with friends in the Charles C. Deem Wilderness in the Hoosier National Forest. The main road in the wilderness is named Tower Ridge Road, after the tall Hickory Ridge fire tower that is smack dab in the middle of the woods. When you pull off on the road into the parking area for the tower, there is an old disused gravel road which leads to a few trails out in the wilderness. At the very end of the road is a very old cemetery. A lot of the headstones are simple sandstone markers indicating that someone is buried there. If there was any information on them to begin with, it had long since eroded away. The area that made up the wilderness was created when the government repossessed farmers' land during the Great Depression. Before that area was farmed for quite a while. So naturally, the poor farming people that lived and farmed the area needed a place to bury their loved ones. Most of the graves in the cemetery were very old, and all of their immediate relatives had long passed away themselves. However, there were a few granite headstones from an early to mid-90s, and a few from wealthier former residents who were able to afford professionally carved headstones dating from the early 20th century. I was camping in a convenient area with close proximity to our vehicle, and the gravel road to make our camping trip all the more comfortable. The only downside to having all of these conveniences was that we had to be near the main trail, so we had a fair amount of foot traffic going by our tents. My friends and myself were friendly to everybody passing by, exchanging pleasantries, and wishing people a good hike. Quite a while after dark had settled in, when we had our fire roaring, and we were all in good spirits after having some drinks and smoking some pot. A person of average build and weight passed our camp, wearing a headlamp with a creepy red filter on it, so we couldn't see his face, and he was carrying a spade with a D grip. We said hello like we had to everybody that passed our tent, but this person was different. This person just passed on by without breaking his stride or saying a word to us. He just acted like we weren't even there. We all thought about how weird that was, but nobody said anything to each other. We soon forgot about our encounter with the weird shovel-wielding man. The next morning, I woke to a beautiful blue sky. The birds were singing, and it was shaping up to be a truly beautiful day. I woke up before my friends, which wasn't unusual for me. I'm always the first one up in the mornings on camping trips. I usually get coffee ready and wake everyone up with the sounds and smell of coffee being made. On this particular trip being a bunch of 20-year-olds, we remembered the booze and weed, but of course forgot the coffee. After standing around for a while and not wanting to wake my friends up, I decided to take the mile or so hike down the disused gravel road and check out the cemetery. I left without telling anyone where I was going. After all, it was a beautiful day. Not too hot, not too cold. The sun was definitely shining. What could possibly go wrong, right? I had soon made the mile or so trek down the gravel road, enjoying the sights and smells of the forest, and I had quickly found the cemetery. It was surrounded by a waist-high chain-link fence with a gate in it. I opened the gate and stepped inside the cemetery, began looking at the graves. Near the entrance to the cemetery, there were a few professionally carved limestone headstones. As I approached the closest one, to my horror, I saw that the grave had been disturbed. There was an approximately 5-foot hole dug near the headstone, with the same D-grip shovel in the bottom of the hole, which was located in the approximate location where the person would have been buried. The hole had 3 terrace-like steps dug into it, so the grave robber could easily get out on their own when they were done doing their dastardly deeds. I inspected the headstone as best as I could under the circumstances. It was limestone and very old, so a lot of the information had long been eroded away. However, I'm fairly certain that the grace belonged to what I think is an infant girl named Elizabeth, who died shortly after her birth in the early 20th century. After my brief inspection, the notion dawned on me that there was only one way in and out of the cemetery, and I hadn't passed anyone on my way in. I wasn't trying to be stealthy in my approach, and I soon realized that the person who dug the hole probably heard me coming and was probably still in the immediate area. All of a sudden, I had the feeling that I was being watched from somewhere in the surrounding forest, and needless to say, I felt very unnerved by the whole situation. I looked around, but I saw nothing but the endless forest on either side of me. I decided to beat a hasty retreat from the area. After I got out of eyeshot of the cemetery, I walked as fast as I could back to the relative safety of our camp. A little while after I got back to camp, my friends started waking up, and naturally, I relayed what had just happened to them. They were just as freaked out by the whole situation as I was. After some discussion, we decided to leave. After we had packed up camp and were about to leave the parking area, we noticed that there was a sign on the gate of the gravel road going to the cemetery, indicating a number for whoever managed the cemetery. Of course, we called the number, and I relayed my story to whoever was on the other end. A few hours later, I received a call from Lawrence County Sheriff's Office asking for my story. They said that they would send an officer to check out the cemetery. Needless to say, I never heard back from them, but I sure as hell hope that I never run into the D-handled shovel-wielding weirdo who would dig up an infant's grave in the middle of the night. I have no idea what this guy could have been after. The area where the cemetery is located is very remote today, and back in the early 20th century, it would have been even more remote. I would imagine that most people would have just buried in a simple homemade unsealed wooden coffin with no embalming. They probably would have just had the local priest over to say a few words, and that would have been that. Later on, they probably paid to have a nice headstone made on this particular grave for their precious daughter. I've been back to this particular area of the woods many times since then. I've even been back to the cemetery in the years since the incident. You can no longer tell if the grave had ever been disturbed. I'm pretty sure I know which one it was, but it's hard to be 100% sure. I've never had another experience that even comes close to this one. A lot of the graves have sunken in due to time causing the caskets to collapse further, making it confusing which grave it would have been. All I can hope for is that poor Elizabeth is able to spend the rest of eternity in peace. In my youth, I had a few friends that had a band in the local scene. And as anyone who had hung around the band scene can tell you, you meet all kinds of strange dudes. This was how I met Marty. Marty was a friend of one of the band members who had just moved into my hometown. At first, the guy seemed pretty cool. He was quite a talented artist and drew all kinds of morbid pictures and murals of the band so that they could use it in their live sets. He was an oddball, but then what artist isn't? But a cool guy to hang out with nonetheless. However, after a while, he started becoming unhinged. Marty started getting drunk and expressed his desire to rob a grave. It wasn't because he was a necro or anything. He said it was because he wanted a human skull to use as a model for his artwork. This started becoming something he would continuously talk about whenever he got into the sauce. And eventually the band members got sick of hearing it and called him out on it. Marty then proceeded to grab a shovel and the keys to his car, asked one of the more sober guys to drive him to a cemetery. Thinking he was full of shit, 3 of the guys got into the car with him and set off to call his bluff. They drove to an old cemetery, dropped Marty off with his shovel and a plastic bag. He instructed them to drive back to the cemetery gates every hour until he returned, and set off into the graveyard. The guys parked the car on a back road and drank a few ales waiting for Marty to return. Eventually, after the 3rd visit to the cemetery, Marty stood outside the gates waiting. He opened the trunk and put the shovel and something wrapped in a garbage bag inside. He got into the car and told them that he got what he came for. He had dug up a 140-year-old grave and stole the human remains buried in it. When they returned to the house, Marty showed them the skeletal remains he had stolen. This didn't sit too well with some of the guys present there, so it didn't come as much of a surprise when it all over the news a week later after Marty was arrested for grave robbing. It also came out that Marty has issues with beating women. It turned out his girlfriend at the time heard about the grave robbing, and tired of being used as Marty's personal punching bag, ratted him out to the cops. While he did get let off easy for the grave robbing charges, the betrayal from his girlfriend, and subsequent harassment he received daily from the local police eventually caused him to leave town for a second time. In the time between being arrested for grave robbing and leaving town, I lost touch with Marty. His behavior was becoming increasingly violent and erratic to the point that he was a liability to be hanging around with. Eventually, I heard he was arrested a second time on multiple charges, including assault, domestic assault, aggravated assault, assault with a weapon, possession with intent, cultivation with intent, sexual interference with a minor. I don't know the details of all these charges, but I heard he was looking at 12 years. I can only imagine how crazy he'll be when he is eventually released. All that I do know is I do own a kick-ass original graphite drawing he made for me that should be worth a mint if he ever goes serial. In the fall of last year, I was walking with my mother in a provincial park that is about 5 minutes away from my house. I lived in Western Ontario. The park is relatively small and has a cemetery, which dates back to when the area was first settled in the mid-1800s. On this particular occasion, we were on a trail, which I had been on many times before, which passes right by that cemetery. I had decided that I wanted to go in for a minute to look around, as I had not been there in a while. There was a gray sedan parked in front of the gate, which was somewhat unusual being that the cemetery is so small, old, and out of the way that it doesn't tend to get many visitors. But its presence still wasn't really noteworthy. I climbed over the gate and started strolling around the cemetery, walking up a crest that had the older graves on the other side of it. I heard some scuffling and rustling sounds. Figured that they were being caused by small animals, or maybe by the owner of the sedan. I wandered through the graves on the other side of the hill until I came to a stop in front of one belonging to a little girl named Rosie, who died in the 1950s, just at the age of 3. Someone had dug a hole over where her little body should have been, and it looked pretty fresh. They had covered the mouth of the hole with sticks and all kinds of things. An empty dog food bag almost like they were hastily trying to hide what they had been doing. I was too scared to move the bag and look in the hole, but from what I could see, it was where the edge of the bag was too short to reach across. It looked to be about 4 or 5 feet deep and 3 feet wide. I did not see anyone else around in the cemetery, but it's worth mentioning that the cemetery is surrounded by fairly dense woods. Needless to say, I did not hang around after this discovery. I ran to the gate where my mom was standing and told her what I had just seen. I asked her if she could call the police or tell a park ranger or something. She told me no. She didn't want to get involved. We left the park pretty quickly after all that. I have no idea what was going on there, but it still makes me really uncomfortable to think about that there could have been someone lurking nearby in the trees while I looked at what they had done to that poor, dead kid's grave. The area that I lived in had its fair share of crime, most of which is meth-related, and it's uncommon to see burnt-out rolling meth labs or paraphernalia in the woods. But I have never seen anything like this. All I can think is that, for some fucked-up reason, someone was trying to dig up that little girl's bones. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe, like, and hit the bell for notifications on future videos, and become a stalker of the night. And I'll see you next time.